You know, in addition to that, I'll do what I can to get through all 5 tiers. I can't promise I'll get through all of them. I'm also gonna do my best to keep an eye on the chat and keep an eye on the Zoom raise hands. But again, there's so many of you in this room, I can't guarantee I'll be able to respond to every question because I do wanna get through as much of this as I can. It is, of course, being recorded, so you can go back and watch this later if you wish as well. So what I've done is here is I have the starting point and I'm running it and I can see what I've got here on port 3000, right? Nothing's going on. We're making a couple of GET requests and nothing's happening with them. I'm also gonna run the tests over here in this other terminal, npm run test dev. And we're gonna take a look at that here. So 48 pending, 0 passing. I think we should just dive right in and get into it. So here's tier 1. So of course, to run a test, we have to change them from XIT to IT. So now the first test is running. And you might notice it takes a while for these tests to run. There's so many of them. What I'm gonna do is I'm going to limit how many tests are running at any one time by appending .only to the first tier. So now we're gonna get a little bit of a smaller test output. We're only running 13 tests. We see here the ones for basic fields, a little bit of express stuff. We have a little sample version of what the table would look like. This is a lot easier for me to read personally. So the first test is failing. It says we're expecting on the basic fields, name and user type, and we're expecting name to be a string. Here we are in the test block trying to create a user with a name of Hannah. And the expect block is expecting Hannah.name to equal Hannah. And if it doesn't, it'll say was not able to create a user with name Hannah, which sure enough, we see here in our test output. We couldn't create a user with name Hannah. So that means our sequelized model is not working as expected. So let me open up the sequelized models and I'll look up user here. And I personally like to have my sequelize or any of my code I'm working on the top and my tests on the bottom, just because it's a stylistic thing. So here in my sequelized model, I can define my fields and I was missing a name field, so I'm gonna add one. I'll say name here. I'm gonna give it a type of sequelize.string, right, like so. And now the first test is passing. Awesome, cool. Let's keep going. We also expect it to be unique. So I'm gonna say here, unique, true, right? And we're getting an error, and my linter would tell me what the error is about, right? My linter says here, unexpected token unique, and that's kind of an odd error, but what it means is I was expecting to see something before that next key. In particular, I'm defining an object, and key value pairs have to be separated by commas in an object. So that fixes that error here. All right, moving forward, name cannot be null. So here I can say allow null, false, like so. Okay, awesome, good stuff, cool. Moreover, name cannot be an empty string. And I seem to remember something about not empty being true, right? Not empty true to add some kind of validation. But interestingly, this doesn't work. I am going to briefly ask for some suggestions from the audience. What did I forget to do? What's wrong with this? So you can do, yeah, someone in the chat said validate. Yeah, so interestingly, not empty is a special like validation key. I need to put it inside of an object for that to work. Great idea. Yep. Okay, moving forward, user type. So we need to make a new field called user type. So that'll be down here below name. I'll say user type, and I'm also gonna give it a type. What type should user type be? Well, it's kind of funky, right? Because like user type, I know that I'm storing strings here. String, student, or teacher. So I could say sequelize.string, and that kind of works, but we're gonna see why in a minute. It may not be ideal. Here it says user type defaults to student if not provided. So I can give it a default value. If I can type, okay, so I'll say it should be student if not provided. There we go, student, excellent. Okay, and then let's see also user type cannot be null. Okay, so here I'll say allow null false. And again, I need my comma there. Allow null false. Okay, we're cruising, we're getting through this. And then here's where things get weird. It says user type can only be either student or teacher. Well, how do I do this? Okay, this is one of those problems where there really are two different options. I saw several different options at least. Anyone have any suggestions? You can raise your hand or put something in chat. What do you think I should do to resolve this test spec here? A lot of people are saying enum. That's actually my preferred method as well. I think that's a good idea. We should make this an enum. I would mention some people I've seen make this with a custom validator, right? Like if you try to set it to something that isn't student or teacher, then yeah, like with the is in validator, yeah, that could work. We could do that. It would be something like validate. I think it would be something like is in, and then give it like an array here. Yeah, teacher. I don't actually know if this passes the tests. I'm not totally sure. I think it doesn't, yeah. On user type failed. So there's something going on here. Anyway, I could continue debugging this, but there's a better way. So the better way is we actually could use a built-in Sequelize type called enum, where we provide it with a couple of options, and it has to be one of those options or it fails. So here's what that would look like. All right, so now this test is passing because we've said, look, it's not just a string type, it's actually an enum type. This is actually baked into how Postgres wants to validate the data. This is, I think, my kind of preferred or recommended way of dealing with this test spec, but granted, there are different approaches. Okay, moving on. User.findUnassignedStudents is a class method. Okay, so let's say to make a class method, what if we did this? Type.findUnassigned students. Okay, is this right? What did I do here? What's going on here? I made a mistake. Yeah, it's not correct. You're right. I did not make a class method. I made an instance method. When I'm adding an instance method, I'm adding the method to the prototype chain, right? So every particular instance of user will inherit the prototype. And so any method that I add to user.prototype would be on the instance, but that's not what I want to do. I want this method to be accessible on the global, or not the global, but the class user here. So user.findUnassignedStudents should be a class method here. There's nothing in it yet, but it passes that test. Second of all, I want to make sure that user.findUnassignedStudents returns all students who do not have a mentor. So here's what I could do. I could say return user.findAll. Okay, let's just see what happens if we do this. Okay, well, looking at the error message, it says here expected 2, but the actual was 4. So I'm returning, I think, too many students. Let me see if I can break this out a little bit and take a look at what the actual data is. So instead of simply returning the promise right away, I'm going to get the data. I'll say users, await user.findAll, and then return users, right? So I'm just doing this so that in the middle, I can console log users like so. And let's see what they are. Oops. What happened? Where's my console log? There's my console log. Okay. So the cool thing about this is it's showing me all of the different users that I got here. One thing I might want to do just to make my console log more concise, because look at all this, there's so much data here. Just to be a little bit more creative, I could make maybe a map statement. So for each user, I want to return an object that just has user, I'll say name, user.name, and user type is user.userType. So here I'm just going to immediately return an object that has only their name and their user type on it. And this would show me a more concise console log. This isn't like necessary to fulfill the test spec, but just wanted to demonstrate if your console logs are giant, consider mapping over the data so it's a little bit more concise. So here the problem is we're getting some users who have the user type teacher, and we don't want those in there. So we want to make sure we're not returning any users that have the teacher user type in there. So that's not great. So I think what we could do is, we could be a little bit silly here. We could just do something like user.filter, and then filter all the users that have the incorrect user type. So I'll say user user type is equal to, right? I could do this, and I think this kind of sort of works, although we're still failing. And of course, you might be wondering, isn't this terrible? Am I doing something wrong? You're right, I am. But I'm going to show you the correct way to do it in a moment. So what all am I getting? I'm finding all of the users here. And I'm getting the Freddie, Jerry, Allie, and Sarah. And I have here a teacher and then 3 students. And let's just kind of get a sense for like what we're expecting to see in this instance. We're grabbing all of the users. So we have Jerry, Allie, Sarah, and Freddie. Jerry, Allie, Sarah, and Freddie. And it looks like, we're getting 3 students here, but we also want to only get students who are unassigned. So maybe what I want to do here is say my filter statement should be a little bit more complex. I think I want this to be something like return true if user.userType is student and if user.mentor ID is null, right? So here what I'm doing is I'm grabbing all of the users and I'm only returning those users who have a user type of student and a mentor ID of null. And that will pass the test, but it's inefficient. The reason it's not efficient is I'm grabbing more rows than I strictly need. I'm grabbing all of the users, all the teachers, all the ones who have mentors, everything. So I could do this, but I would rather not. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to say, inefficient. And I'll make a more efficient implementation up here. So I'll say users await user dot find all. And I'm going to put in a where clause. So inside of this where clause, I'll say where user type is equal to student and where mentor ID is null, right? And so here I am retrieving the users, but I am not returning them, right? Because I commented out my return down below. So let me just return the users like that. I think that should pass the test as well. Good, excellent. I'll do this here. Okay, cool. Moving on. Let's talk about Express. I think we're on the Express portion now. So I'm going to open up my Express routes because I have a feeling I'm going to need them. So here are my Express routes, and I've got a little bit of an indication about where they are mounted. So it looks like the prefix is API/users. So what I'm going to do is add a route for the first get route. So the first get route should be API get user API/users/unassigned. So I'm just going to copy this because I'm lazy and say router.get, and this should be /unassigned, and I'm going to make a function. And I'm guessing this is going to need to be an async function. So I'm just going to anticipate my needs and make it async with rec, res, and next. And just to be silly, I'll say res.send hello. This isn't done yet, but I'd like to see what the error message is. Oh, I should unpen the test, shouldn't I? So it's expecting to return all unassigned students, but instead it says here expected empty object to be an array. That's on line 173. So if I look at line 173, here it's expecting the response body to be an array, but it's not an array. So I could make that one pass by just being a little bit obstinate and putting in an array directly. Okay, well that one kind of worked, right? It is an array, but it's expecting there to be, some names in the array, objects with names that include Wanda and Eddie. So I'm probably doing the wrong thing by just returning a hard-coded array, I'm guessing. So how about instead I say, let's get the unassigned students. I'm just going to call them students, and I'll await user dot, well, I could say user dot find all, where user type, wait, I feel like I've done this before. In fact, I feel like I've done this like a moment ago. So how about I just do this? Find unassigned students. Awesome, cool. And I'll just return them here. I said return and I was lying to you. We're not returning the students, we are res.sending them. We're sending a response with the students. The funny thing about Express, it doesn't particularly care what you return from these Express routers. They don't care, you can do whatever you want. Sometimes it is useful to make an early return Of course, not in this case, because then we would never send a response. But just highlighting really what we often care about in an express route is what are we sending? What response are we sending? So I think this part should work. And you know what? If we've done our class method find unassigned students correctly, these other tests should pass as well. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to go and re-implement that where clause if we don't have to. We've already done that once. I think this wraps up tier 1. I'm going to get rid of my .only and start running tier 2. Here's tier 2. I'm going to go back to my sequelize model. Okay, tier 2, I think we're going to do only this one as well. And real quick before we proceed, I'm going to take a look at our browser and see if anything is different. I'm going to refresh. Hey, look, here are the unassigned students. We're still getting a 404 not found for the teachers, but we do have the ability to see the students. That's great. Okay, working through this. Tier 2, we want to be able to have a new class method called find teachers and mentees. So let's work on that. So we know we need a class method. I'm going to be lazy and simply copy this and rename it. So this one should be find like this, find teachers and mentees. All right, cool. So what does this one need to do? Let's go and start unpending some tests. There is a little link here to eager loading, and I kind of want to see it. I can click on this from VS Code and take a look at what the docs are saying. So this is a pretty specific section of the docs. It's fetching an aliased association. So the association here is, let's actually take a look. If we scroll up a little bit, I think we're going to see the example in the docs is, yeah, here. So a user has many tools. And the alias is as instrument. And that actually looks familiar to me. Where have I seen that before? Oh yeah, right here. So user has many user, right? So it's a table that references itself. User has many user as mentees. So that indicates to me, this is one of those aliased associations the documentation was talking about. So let's go back to where our link sent us and get a general sense for how to do this. If we're trying to do eager loading, if we're trying to do eager loading, Sequelize is expecting us to use an include inside of our query. So it's expecting us to include some other model or the same model if it's self-referencing, whatever, and then apply the alias here as instruments in this example. So with that in mind, I'm also just gonna be a little bit lazy and comment this, copy this and put it into my code just to kind of get a sense. Now it's not correct, of course, because we're not dealing with tools and instruments. So instead, let's say model should be user, and then as mentees. And I'm just gonna console log what the users are. I also think I should probably, yeah, that's good, that's cool, let's do that. And then I guess I'll return them here. Cool. I need to unpend this, don't I? And I think I'm already passing this test because I do believe find teachers and mentees is a class method. We're expecting it to return all teachers. So the problem is, again, we are now returning too many users. We're returning 5 and we should be returning 2. So it looks like we are including some students in our result here. We're including a student, another student, you know, that's not great, but we are including the teachers as well. So here I have an include that I kind of manipulated from the docs. I also need a where clause. So I'll say in this where clause, where user type is equal to teacher, like so. So I can have a where clause and an include clause. And again, I'm very good at forgetting commas. It's my favorite self-quality. So that looks like that one is now passing. And I'm going to get rid of my console log because it's going to be very annoying otherwise. Okay, cool. So that's neat. That part works. Let's keep going, and it should return all teachers assigned mentees. So this one I got past with the include, but let me just comment it out to show you what the result would look like. Here it's saying cannot find mentees on the teachers. So in other words, the users have been retrieved. I've got all the teachers, so I did my filtering properly, but I didn't include the associated mentees. I didn't get those, the students who are associated with the teacher. So this is why this part here is important. Moving forward, let's do a little bit of Express, and then after tier 2, I'm gonna pause for a moment and take some questions. So here for tier 2, On the Express portion, let me open up my Express server. And again, I'm just gonna kind of copy and make some adjustments. So that's for unassigned, and I'm gonna make one for teachers here. And this one should be something like find teachers and mentees, like so. And it shouldn't be called students, we should call them teachers, like so. Okay, returns or responds with all teachers, responds with all teachers and their mentees, and I think tier 2 is set. Okay, I did a lot of stuff, and I think it's important to take a brief pause so that I can drink some water because I'm parched, and also take some questions. So I want no fewer than 2 Zoom hands raised before I move on to tier 3. So ask me your questions. You can raise your hand if you want, so the Zoom raise hand. Oh, you can't raise your hand, really? Oh no, here I am, I'm so mean. I'm telling you to raise your hand and you can't do it. Why is that? Why is Zoom being so silly?
Yeah, I can. Why?
You can't? That's so odd. Well, anyway, you are welcome to ask your question.
Thank you. When you were assigning, where is it? Oh yeah, on when you did the class method, the find and assign students. Um, this you wrote it with an async as an async function, but is that like can you write it without that? Like, is there any difference? Because I had it without the async and it works. So what's the difference?
Perfect. I love that question. That's a wonderful question. So in principle, in this case, I actually don't need the async and the await. That sounds crazy. The reason is an async function will always return a promise. And sometimes inside of the body of the function, we actually need to put a sequence of promises that happen one after another before the function can be done. But in this function, I only have one promise, and it's user.findAll. So what I could do is I could get rid of the async, right, like this, and get rid of the await, and simply return the users. And let me get rid of my dot only so that we can make sure we're actually running these tests. And believe me when I say it still works. I would maybe rename this variable so that it's more clear, because this is no longer an array of users. It's a promise for the users, right? Because here user.findAll returns a promise. And in this case, I'm not awaiting the promise before I return, but that's actually okay because again, it's always going to return that same promise regardless. If I want to be even more concise, I could even simply say return user.findAll. This is perfectly adequate, totally works. Sometimes my default state is to put async and then await the variable before I'm finished, mainly because I often want to do some console logging while I'm debugging the function. And then maybe I'll remove the async await afterwards to make it more concise, but it actually works fine either way. Cool, we've got one down. I need one more question before I am allowed to move on. This is a restriction I've given to myself. I refuse to break it. So give me a question. And I don't know why you can't raise your hand. That's so odd. Sometimes Zoom is just dumb like that. So I guess in chat, say, I want to raise hand or something like that. Question, can I see the find teachers and mentees for a sec? Yes, here we go. Okay, I'll roll on. All right. Okay, the routes, yeah, sure. Here we go. You might be wondering, I feel like I'm forgetting something, and I am. So I'm not quite done with these routes. I'll have to return to them near the end. Yeah, and you're right. We do need to add an async. Well, so the comment in chat, just to point out, I guess we can add async to either the class method or the router. As long as one is there, it should work. That's basically true, but there's actually one catch. I need to put await in front of this function call regardless, right? I need to have an await here because user.find unassigned students returns a promise. And if I want to work with the data that's packaged inside of that promise, I have to await it, no exceptions. It's just a matter of do the internals of that find unassigned students function, does that function need to await some promise before it's ready to return? And in this particular case, it doesn't. But I need to have the await here. I can't get away without it. Okay, all right. I will work on tier 3 now. So tier 3, here's tier 3. Back to the sequelize. So tier 3 is about virtual fields, route parameters, and delete routes. And I'm going to put a little dot only here as well. Okay, so for tier 3, we're expecting to see some virtual fields. So virtual fields are kind of wacky and weird. Let's open up the docs and see what they look like. So here are some virtual fields. So we get to define a virtual field that has like a getter in it. So if we scroll down a little bit, virtual fields. So a virtual field, for instance, full name is a good example. Its type is datatypes.virtual, or we can also do sequelize.virtual. They're both fine. And we define our own getter. So if we were to get user.fullname, it would simply concatenate first name plus last name, right? So this is another example where we have to kind of read the documentation, and it's not exactly what we need, but it's close enough, and we kind of have to interpret it and apply it to our own code. So I'm going to go back up to the model here, and I'll say is student, and let me actually run my code here. Let's take a look at this. Yeah, expected undefined to equal true. Perfect. So here I want the type to be, oh, not an object. Sequelize, not service worker, sequelize dot virtual, right? And then a getter, where I think for the getter, what I want it to do is it should be false if the user is not a student. Okay, so here I'll run this. It says expected undefined to equal true because I've made a getter for the virtual field, but it's not returning anything. So it's always going to return undefined. I could return like potato. And here in my output, it's going to say expected potato to equal true or expected potato to equal false. I encourage you to do silly stuff like this, honestly, because if you can make sure that your return values are at least showing up in your error console or your browser or whatever, then at least you know they're hooked up. But here what we want to do is we want to say, like, how do I get like the user dot user type is equal to student, right? Ultimately, that's what we want to return. Where do we get the user from, though? Well, in this case, the user, we can access off the this object, right? Because the is student property is a property of any particular user instance. So when we're getting the is student property, we're getting it off of that user instance. So a particular user will have a user type property, and we want to return true if the user type is equal to student and false if they're not. So we can simply return this Boolean expression, and that should do it for us for is student. And then we also want to make sure is student is virtual. It shouldn't appear as a column in the database. So if I had done something like, Boolean here, it's kind of going to work, but it shouldn't show up in the table. It shouldn't show up in my database table. So I want it to be virtual. Okay. It's basically a derived field. We can derive the is student property from the other properties, like the user type property. Is teacher, I'm honestly going to pretty much duplicate my work here because it's very similar. So is teacher, I got to get my comma. It's a virtual field as well, but I want to return true if and only if they are a teacher. Here we have is teacher there as well. And of course, is teacher is virtual. It should not appear as a column in the database. Cool stuff. Moving on, let's make some delete routes, or rather a delete route. So I'll say router.delete, and let's take a look at our code, our tests here. So it should delete an existing user by their ID and respond with 204. So here I'll say, well, how do I get the particular ID? Well, I can do this with an ID, like a parameter. And so I'm going to put a colon in front of that. So the express route will interpret whatever comes after API/users and put that on my rec.params object. So here I got to get my rec, my res, my next, and we'll go from there. So how do I do this? How do I delete? Well, one thing I could do is I could say const user to be deleted. This is a very silly name. What am I, a Java developer? Long variable names. So what I'm going to say is user.find by pk. And so I'm going to put in rec.params.id, right? Because again, ID shows up as a property on rec.params. If I had done something odd, like if I'd say banana, banana, this would work too. Totally fine. As long as these two things match, whatever I put up here in the colon will be applied literally to rec.params on that object. So rec.params.banana somehow now refers to the user by their ID, by their primary key. Now I've got the user, maybe, let's see. I should await this and async on the function. And then I could say await user to be deleted dot destroy, right? Now, typically, I would have to go look at the documentation to figure out how do I delete an instance from SQLize. I happen to remember that it's the destroy method, but this would also be a process where I go look in the documentation and figure out what's going on. Here it says, interestingly, it says timeout of 2 seconds exceeded. So the reason is I think I did successfully destroy this user from the database. I believe at least that I did that, but I'm never sending a response. Every express route should send a response. So I think according to the test, I should respond with 200. So I could do res.status 204.send, right? That could work. There's actually a shorthand for this, which is res.send status, which just basically does the same thing on the line above. They're both equivalent. They're both fine. Send status is maybe a little bit more descriptive or concise, but they're both totally fine. So I think this should be fulfilling this test. Let's keep going. So what if they give an ID for a user that doesn't exist? So in this test block, the ID they're putting in there is, I think, 10,000. And there just aren't 10,000 users in the database. So we want to convey to the user that the request they made was valid, right? They didn't do anything wrong per se, but they're requesting to delete a user that doesn't exist. And at this point, I just can't call the user's ID banana anymore. It's hurting me. So I'm going to call it ID. So what do we want to do in this case? Well, if we try to do user.find by pk with a primary key that doesn't exist, it will return null. And let me show you an example of that. So console.log user to be deleted, right? And the first time my test runs, I can see, look at this. This is the user that I found by doing user.findMyPK. And the second time, it's null. So here I am console logging to validate that my assumptions are correct, that if I try to retrieve a user by ID and it's not in the database, it'll give me null. So I bet what I could do here is I could say, if user to be deleted is equal to null, then I could say res.send status of 404. I'm going to make this a little bit larger so we can see more of it. Right, like this. Okay, so that would kind of work. But even still, there's a little bit of a problem, right? Here what I'm doing is I'm checking to see if the user to be deleted is null, and then I'm sending status 404. But I'm not exiting this function. And so even after I've confirmed that they don't exist and I've tried to send a status, I then try to destroy a user that I am sure doesn't exist. So what I could do is I could say something like make an if-else statement, right? This would work just fine. I think this is a totally valid approach. Another thing I could do, and I kind of like doing this, is if I've made a check to assert that the user doesn't exist and I'm ready to send a response, I might just do an early return. you know, send status and then return, which exits out of the function. I think of this as kind of like a function gatekeeper. I'm checking to make sure we really do need to proceed through the rest of the function. If not, we can send a status and return and we're done. So this kind of works. We still have more work to do. So what if they give us an ID that is crazy? So in the first example, they gave us an ID for a user that does exist. The second time they gave us an ID 10,000, which is a valid ID, but there isn't a user with that ID. In the third example, they're giving us a string instead of a number. Not a valid ID is not a valid ID. So how do we deal with that? Well, one thing we could do is let's just kind of take a look at what the ID looks like. So I'll say console log rec.params.id. And in this third case, we're going to see it's going to say not a valid ID. So how can I check to see if a string from the rec.params.id could be turned into a number if I wanted it to be? Anyone have any ideas? I'd like to solicit some suggestions from chat. Number's a good idea, or isNaN, parse int. These are all great ideas. Yep, this is one of those situations where there really are multiple different good answers. I'm going to take the approach of using number and then isNaN. I like that idea. I'm tired of typing rec.params.id over and over again. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to say const id is equal to rec.params.id. Like so. And this way I can use ID to be more concise here. And, you know, rec.params.id equals ID, that's fine, but I'm feeling fancy, so I'm going to destructure. So I'm going to say ID comes off of the object rec.params. I haven't changed the functionality in any way. In fact, I'm going to leave the earlier version up here just so we can see them side by side. So these are equivalent, but I'm going to use the destructuring one on the bottom because, I don't know, I feel like it. So here's ID. I'll say something like, you know, what if we try to convert ID to a number? So if we try to convert ID to a number, then what happens? So console log what is ID? Oh, this is actually silly. Why am I doing this? I should make this a separate variable. That's okay. I'll just do it this way for now. What is ID? 10,000. And then the second example was an error, invalid input syntax for integer, not a valid ID. But in this case here, we're seeing what is ID 10,000, and in the second case, it's null, right? I believe that's what's going on there. Let me just make sure. Yeah, what is ID 1? Perfect, cool. So I think what we can do is we can check to see if it's null. So here I could say if number ID is equal to null, then I could say res.send status, and I want to send status 400, right? So I'll say 400, and I'll follow the pattern above and return. Some of you may be anticipating this problem, and I love it. So this one is strange, right? It seems like I'm still moving on. I'm still moving to the next line because I'm still trying to put in not a valid ID in my user.findByPK. What the heck? Why is that going on? Let me show you something absolutely just plain terrible. In JavaScript, here's a question. Is null equal to null? Well, duh, of course it is, right? I mean, a string is equal to itself, a number is equal to itself. Like, come on, Vin, you're crazy. Null is definitely equal to null. Now, wait a minute, that is true. That's actually kind of odd, interesting. So number ID should be equal to null. That's actually not what I saw earlier. That's so fascinating. Maybe if I make two variables, I'll say node const 1 is equal to null, const 2 is equal to null, and then is 1 equal to 2? Oops. Yeah, they are. Okay, fascinating. Well, that's not what I was expecting, but that's cool, you know. The problem here is what I really want to say is if I'm coercing ID to a number, I really want to check whether it is equal to null, strictly speaking. So I think what I really want to do here is say is nan, and I can put this here, like so. And I think, oh, this should be capital N there. Okay. So this part works. So I'm strictly checking to see if this number could be coerced to a number. If it can't be, it will become null. And I want to check to see if the result of that coercion is truly null or not. Anyway. Oh, I'm sorry. You're in the chat telling me exactly what I did wrong. Thank you so much. It's not that null isn't equal to null. It's that if I try to coerce a string to a number with the number coercion, it'll return nan, not null, nan, not a number. So here's nan, right? So the question is nan equal to nan? And that one is false, which is absurd because everything should be equal to itself, but it's not in this case. So that's why we need to be a bit more careful. So thank you for that help. Okay, so these are now passing. That looks good to me. I'm going to get rid of my annoying console logs and kind of move on from here. So here what we're doing is we're finding a user if the ID is correct, if the ID really is a number. If they exist, we destroy them. But if they don't exist, we're sending a status of 404 and then returning. So this is what tier 3 could look like. I'm going to get rid of my dot only and move on to tier 4. How am I doing on time? Okay, it's 1:15 or 2:15 Central Time. So let's keep going. Here we are on the Sequelize user model. Let's go and add some dot only here. Briefly, I'm going to look at what my front end looks like. So if I refresh, if I refresh, I should see I've got tier 1 over here on the right for unassigned students. I've got tier 2 for teachers, and I should be able to delete something. So if I delete poor Wanda, Wanda's gone. Wonderful. And if I try to delete a teacher like Lucy, Lucy's also gone. And I can also delete Steve. Okay, so cool. So I think that my delete route is working correctly. And I can even see in my Morgan logger on my backend, I've made a delete request for these 3 users. So I'm just kind of confirming that what I'm seeing on the front end corresponds to what I'm seeing on my backend with my Express logger working correctly. Okay, great. Moving on to tier 4. Tier 4 is kind of short, but that doesn't mean it's easy, as you probably noticed. So for tier 4, we actually don't need anything in Sequelize. This is all about Express. We're going to make a post route, so a router.post. And we actually don't need to add anything after the prefix because we're simply posting to API/users. So I'm just going to make this a slash. And I'll give it a body, like so. Give it rec.res.next, like this. And I'm guessing I'm going to need some awaiting in here. So I'm going to do an async as well. So here's the idea. What we want to do is make sure we can access whatever's in rec.body and try to create a new user. And if we are successful in creating a new user, we want to respond with 201 and the newly created user. So here's what we'll do. We'll say const new user is equal to user.create, right? Briefly, before I go forward, I want to identify a difference here. In tier 3 with my delete route, when I do destroy, I'm using the instance method destroy. I'm destroying an instance that I earlier retrieved when I did user.findByPK. You know, user.findByPK is an example of a class method that's built into every Sequelize model, user.findByPK. Here, user.create is also a class method. So I'm not creating from an instance, I'm creating an instance from the user model. I hope that makes sense. Let's create a new instance. And what should we pass in to user.create? How about rec.body? And I'm going to res.send new user, like so. Nope. Like this. Okay, so this is kind of working. So here I'm getting through, I'm doing this part where I'm successfully creating a new user, but I think I am, but I'm not actually responding with the correct status code. So I could do like a res.status 201, and that would work. I could also link these together. So I could say, because these are chainable, so I could say instead res.status.send like this. And oh, I didn't actually call status, did I? So let me do that instead. Here we go, good. So that would pass this first test here. So I'm just creating the user and then responding with them. Moreover, we want to know, hey, is the user's name already taken? If you remember from tier 1, we said that a user's name has to be unique. We can't have 2 users with the same name. So what do we want to do in this case? A couple ideas. One thing we could do is we could say, does name exist? And that would be something like await user.find1, where name is equal to rec.body.name. And I think I'm gonna have to mute someone real quick. Yeah, cool. All right. So we can check to see, did we find a user that has a name matching rec.body.name? And I'm just gonna console log does name exist here in my route. And here in this second case, when I'm running the test, I can see sure enough, there's a user that has the name of Mo, which matches what I'm seeing in the student. I'm trying to create a user with Mo. And in the first example of the tests, the result is null. So if I don't find a user with that name, it's null. And if I do, it's a user object. So what I could do is I could say, if does name exist, then I could maybe do all of this stuff where I do these things here. And I'm probably going to do an early return just because. Otherwise, I'm going to res.send status of 409, right? So if the name does exist, in other words, I'm sorry, this should be the reverse. Yeah, sorry, if the name doesn't exist, then I want to create a user and then send status 201. Otherwise, I want to send status 409. So here's what that would look like. I think that should pass this test. And I'm going to get rid of my console log. Some of you might have noticed that we could also use find or create. I'm seeing an example of that in the chat. That's a great suggestion. I want to show that off real quick. So here's what we could do. I could say, I'll say user is equal to await user.find or create. Okay, now find or create, what is that all about? With find or create, we give it a where clause. In other words, what properties of the user are we looking for? We're trying to see if there's any user that matches a name equal to rec.body.name. So if name is equal to rec.body.name, then we have found the user and we don't need to create them. And here I'll just say res.status of 201.send user, right? Let's see what this does. Okay, we're close. We're not quite there. Because of course, we haven't checked to see if we found a user that has that name or not, right? So what is this user object exactly? What does it return? Okay, let's see, let's find out. So interestingly, it looks like it's returning an array, right? And it seems like a normal user object, but it's wrapped in an array, right? And the first thing in the array is the user that was found or created. And the second thing in the array is a Boolean, true or false. So basically it's telling you, did we create a user? In the first case, it's true, we did create a user. And the second case, it's false because we didn't need to, we found one. So what we need to do actually is destructure the result of user.find or create. Now we're used to doing object destructuring, which is frankly more common, but we can also destructure arrays that we get back from some query. We don't have to do this. This is just kind of syntax sugar. It's fancy, but I like it. So the first thing in the array is the user. And the second thing is a Boolean for was it created? So here's what we could do. We could say if was created, then res.send the user like this, and then I'll do a return as well. Otherwise, res.send status. So res.send status 409, right? Because we found a user that has that name, like so, right? And that'll pass the test. This is perfectly fine, frankly. This is like enough to pass the tests. There is something else you can do with find or create, which basically is, hey, we're gonna try to find a user that has this name. If they exist, then just return the user you found. If they don't exist, here are some ways to populate the other fields you might need when creating the user, right? So finding the user by name is different than creating the user with all the remaining fields that we might care about. This is totally like optional. You don't need this to pass pillars or whatever. We only care about creating users by name because that's all we have in the front end, right? Our software development project manager didn't tell us to worry about the other fields. But if we're trying to be completionist, we could add it too. So here, this would be something like defaults. So with defaults, we pass it an object that has all of the remaining properties we might want to create on the object. And that's what this would look like here. So this is totally bonus. You don't need it. But, you know, kind of fun. Okay, that is tier 4. Here we are approaching tier 5, and we're also approaching the end of lunch. Tier 5 is, of course, quite tricky. There's a lot of stuff going on in tier 5. So let me do what I can just to preview stuff. I think what I'll do is before we actually get through tier 5, I'm going to have you go back to doing Redium, and I can record kind of the last bit of this video as a separate video and then send that out as well so you can get a sense for how that works. But I don't want to cut into your pair exercise time. Briefly, so tier 5 is about the SQLize update hook, which is quite tricky, a put route, and also some express error handling. We want that to go through as well. You know, briefly, I think we know that the tier 4 works correctly because we should be able to create students. So here we have like, I'm gonna open up my DevTools and look at my network tab here. I can create a student with a name of Finn, and there they go. They show up in unassigned students. And if I try to create another user with the name Finn, it doesn't get created. And in fact, I can see in my network tab in my browser that the status I got back from the server was 409, which stands for a conflict. You tried to create two things that can't both exist. Great, good stuff. So tier 5 is neat. Yeah, it's 125 central, so I think this is a natural place to break. I promise I will record a short little video explaining the update hook and the put routes and that kind of thing. But I wanted to take a couple minutes to take some questions before we wrap up and you go back to your pair exercise. So ask away. No questions at all. Perfect comprehension. Your questions were from tier 5. Well, go ahead and ask your question from tier 5 as well, too. You're welcome to do that. Hooks, yep. How about them hooks, though? Yeah, it's good that you used try catch all along. You know, I was sort of mimicking the process because I wanted to get to tier 5 and then I'll show you why it's bad. But you should be doing try catch all the time. All of these express routes should have a try catch wrapping them because if an error occurs, such as the database catches on fire, we want to be able to gracefully exit and send the user a status code rather than the server just kind of blowing up and getting confused. But I was trying to get to that point when we get to tier 5, so I'll make sure I demo that in the remaining video. But you should be doing try catch all the time. Okay, cool. More questions, please. All right. Cool. So does get simply evaluate whatever is returned to true or false? That's a great question. So this is from the virtual fields we had over there. It's not something special about get, to be honest. It's really just about what function return values look like. So here's what I could do. I could say, you know, if user type teacher is true, return true. Right? Else, right? So this is what I could do, and this is perfectly valid, nothing wrong with this. But like, you know, one thing I'll point out is like, this is a little silly because user type equals teacher is always either going to be true or false, right? So like, if it's true, then this if condition will be true, and otherwise it'll be false. So this trailing equals true is redundant. We don't actually need it. But let's go even further, right? Like if user type is teacher, then return true. otherwise return false. But what I just said is still true, right? What I just said was that this dot user type equals teacher will either be true or it will be false. And we simply want to return whether it's true or false. So we could more succinctly say exactly the same thing as all of this down below in one line. They do exactly the same thing. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. That's a good time to wrap. So I'm going to close this recording, and as promised, I'll record a smaller, shorter video for tier 5, and I'll send that out as well and send this to your cohorts. All right, go back to Redium. Go do some React Router stuff. Have fun with all that.